Mira Collins saw the scar, and her world cracked open. The janitor, Walter Hemsley, felt his breath die in his throat when the 12-year-old pointed to the crescent moon carved into his wrist, identical to her own. In the fluorescent hum of Dayton Middle School, a question hung between them like smoke from a fire long extinguished. "Why do you have the same scar as me?" she asked. And Walter could not speak, could not move, could only feel the past rising like floodwater to drown him. This is the story their scars demanded they tell. The hallway stretched before Mira Collins like a tunnel carved from institutional beige, its walls lined with construction paper cutouts of autumn leaves that rustled slightly under the air conditioning's wheeze. She walked with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her sneakers squeaking against linoleum that had been mopped so many times it held a permanent sheen, reflecting the flickering overhead lights in wavering pools. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint sweetness of cafeteria pizza lingered in the air, creating a scent she had come to associate with the endless rhythm of school days. Mira was 12 years old, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail that swung as she moved, and eyes that her mother said were too observant for her own good. She had been thinking about her algebra homework, about the way numbers could lock into place like puzzle pieces when she saw him, the janitor, Walter Hemsley, kneeling beside a locker with his toolkit open, replacing a broken hinge with the methodical patience of someone who had learned to make every small repair matter. She had seen him countless times before, of course, a fixture as permanent as the trophy case near the principal's office or the water fountain that always ran too cold. Walter was a man who seemed designed to be invisible, his grey uniform blending into the walls, his movements economical and quiet, his face weathered in a way that suggested years of outdoor work before he had found himself here, in these fluorescent corridors. Mira had never paid him much attention, the way children rarely notice the adults who maintain the spaces they inhabit, but today something shifted. As she passed, Walter reached for a screwdriver, his sleeve riding up his forearm, and in that brief exposure of skin, Mira saw it, a scar, pale and crescent-shaped, curving just above his wrist like a sliver of moon pressed into flesh. Her feet stopped moving without her conscious decision, her breath catching in her throat as recognition flared through her nervous system like electricity. She looked down at her own left wrist, at the identical mark she had carried for as long as she could remember, the scar her parents had always explained away as a childhood accident too early to recall. The similarity was not approximate or suggestive, it was exact. The same curve, the same placement, the same faint silvery texture against skin. Mira felt something fundamental shift inside her, as though a door she had not known existed had suddenly swung open, revealing a room she had been living beside all her life. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, each beat seeming to echo in the empty hallway, and she became acutely aware of every sensation. The weight of her backpack pulling at her shoulders, the coolness of the air on her face, the distant sound of a teacher's voice lecturing behind a closed classroom door. Walter continued working, unaware of her scrutiny, his hands steady as he tightened the screws on the new hinge. And Mira realized she was staring, her body frozen in a posture of stunned attention. She wanted to walk away, to dismiss what she had seen as coincidence, but her feet would not obey, rooted to the linoleum as firmly as if they had been nailed there. Walter must have felt the weight of her gaze because he turned his head, his eyes meeting hers with the mild curiosity of someone interrupted in routine labor. He was 56 years old, though he looked older, his face lined with the kind of fatigue that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from carrying invisible burdens across decades. His hair was more grey than brown, cut short and practical, and his eyes were a pale blue that seemed faded, as though they had looked at too many things they wished they could unsee. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, janitor and student, separated by age and circumstance and the unspoken hierarchies of school life. Then Mira lifted her arm, her hand trembling slightly as she pushed back her sleeve, exposing the crescent scar on her wrist. She held it out toward him like an offering, like evidence in a trial neither of them understood they were part of. And Walter's expression underwent a transformation so complete it seemed as though a mask had been stripped away, revealing raw terror beneath. His face went pale, the color draining from his skin until he looked almost grey, and Mira saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard, his mouth opening as if to speak before closing again. The screwdriver slipped from his fingers and clattered against the floor, the sound absurdly loud in the quiet hallway, and Walter's hand moved to his own wrist, covering the scar as though he could hide it retroactively, as though denying her sight of it might undo what had already been seen. Mira watched emotions flicker across his face like shadows from a fire. Shock, recognition, fear, and something else, something that looked almost like grief. She waited for him to say something, to offer an explanation or a dismissal, to do anything that would make sense of this impossible coincidence. Instead, Walter seemed to shrink into himself, his shoulders curving forward, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps that suggested panic barely contained. The air between them grew heavy, with unspoken questions thick as smoke, and Mira felt her own breath matching his rhythm, both of them caught in the grip of something neither could name, but both recognized as profoundly dangerous. "Why do you have the same scar as me?" The words came out of Mira's mouth before she had fully decided to speak them, her voice smaller than she intended, almost childlike in its vulnerability. The question hung in the fluorescent-lit space between them, simple and devastating, and Walter's eyes closed as though she had struck him. When he opened them again, they were glassy with something that might have been tears, and Mira saw his throat work as he tried to form words, his lips moving soundlessly like a fish pulled from water. No sound emerged, his voice trapped somewhere deep inside him, locked behind walls of fear and shame that had been constructed over years. Mira felt her own eyes burning, though she did not understand why, felt a strange pressure building in her chest, as though her body knew something her mind had not yet grasped. The school bell rang suddenly, a harsh electronic sound that made them both flinch, and the hallway began to fill with students pouring from classrooms, their voices and laughter crashing over the fragile moment like waves destroying a sandcastle. Walter grabbed his toolkit with shaking hands and stood, his movements jerky and desperate. And before Mira could speak again, before she could demand the answer he owed her, he was walking away, disappearing into the surge of bodies as though he had never been there at all. The rest of the school day passed in a blur for Mira, the usual routines rendered meaningless by the weight of what she had witnessed. She sat through English class without hearing a word Mrs. Patterson said about metaphor and symbolism, her hand repeatedly drifting to her wrist, fingers tracing the familiar curve of the scar she had never questioned before. The classroom felt too bright, the fluorescent lights harsh against her eyes, and she found herself staring at the clock above the whiteboard, watching the minute hand creep forward with agonizing slowness. Around her, classmates took notes and raised hands and existed in the comfortable ignorance of people whose identities had never been called into question. Mira envied them their certainty, their ability to move through the world without suddenly feeling as though the ground beneath them had turned to water. When the bell finally released them, she gathered her books mechanically, her body performing the familiar actions while her mind spun in circles, returning again and again to the look on Walter Hemsley's face, that expression of pure terror mixed with something that might have been recognition or remembrance or both. She found herself walking the hallways with new awareness, her eyes scanning for the grey uniform that would mark Walter's presence. The school suddenly felt like a maze designed to hide him, its identical corridors branching in confusing patterns, its crowds of students providing perfect camouflage for someone who had spent years learning to be invisible. Mira passed the janitor's closet near the gym, its door firmly shut, and felt an urge to knock, to demand entrance, to force the confrontation Walter had fled from. But something held her back. Not fear exactly, but a sense that whatever truth lay behind those matching scars required a kind of courage she had not yet summoned. Instead, she continued walking, her sneakers squeaking against linoleum that Walter himself had probably mopped earlier that morning, and tried to imagine what could possibly connect a 12-year-old girl from a comfortable home to a 56-year-old janitor who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. At lunch, Mira sat with her usual friends at their usual table in the cafeteria, a space defined by the smell of industrial cooking and the cacophony of hundreds of conversations happening simultaneously. Her best friend Emma was talking about the upcoming school dance, about what she planned to wear and who she hoped would ask her, her voice bright with the kind of excitement that belonged to a world Mira suddenly felt separated from. Mira picked at her sandwich without tasting it, nodding at appropriate moments while her mind remained elsewhere, replaying that moment in the hallway when their eyes had met and something unspoken had passed between them. She wanted to tell Emma about it, to share the strange encounter, and see if saying it aloud would make it seem less earth-shattering. But every time she opened her mouth to speak, the words died on her tongue. How could she explain something she herself did not understand, something that felt too big and too fragile to be contained in casual conversation over turkey sandwiches and chocolate milk? The afternoon classes were no better, each period stretching into eternity as Mira's concentration fractured and reformed around the central mystery of the scar. In history class, Mr. Davidson lectured about the Civil War, about division and reunion and the long shadow of conflict, and Mira found herself wondering about her own history, the parts that existed before her memory began. Her parents had always been vague about her early childhood, offering gentle deflections whenever she asked about her birth or her first years. They loved her completely, she had never doubted that, but there was a quality to their love that she now recognized as protective, as though they were shielding her from something they believed would hurt her. The scar had always been part of that protection, explained away as an accident when she was too young to remember, a story she had accepted because she had no reason to question it. Now, having seen that same mark on Walter Hemsley's wrist, she felt the foundation of her understanding beginning to crack, fault lines spreading through everything she had taken for granted. When the final bell rang, releasing students into the October afternoon, Mira did not head toward the buses like she normally would. Instead, she found herself wandering back through the school's interior, moving against the flow of bodies eager to escape into freedom. The hallways emptied quickly, the noise and energy draining away until only silence remained, broken occasionally by the distant sound of a locker slamming or a teacher's footsteps on tile. Mira walked with purpose now, her earlier hesitation burned away by hours of obsessive thought, and she made her way toward the basement level where the maintenance offices were located. The stairs leading down were poorly lit, the bulbs at half strength, casting everything in amber shadow that made the walls seem to close in. The air grew cooler as she descended, carrying the scent of concrete and storage and the accumulated dust of decades. At the bottom, a corridor stretched before her, lined with doors marked with utilitarian labels: electrical, storage, maintenance. Mira's heart hammered as she approached the last door, the one that bore a small nameplate reading W. Hemsley, and she raised her hand to knock before fear could stop her. The knock echoed in the empty corridor, loud and insistent, and for a long moment nothing happened. Mira waited, her breath held, her entire body tensed for flight or confrontation, or whatever this moment would bring. Then she heard movement behind the door, the scrape of a chair against concrete, footsteps approaching slowly, reluctantly. The door opened a crack, and Walter's face appeared in the gap, his eyes widening when he saw who stood there. For several heartbeats neither spoke, the silence between them charged with everything that had gone unsaid earlier. Mira saw that Walter had been crying, or was trying not to cry. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn in lines of exhaustion that seemed to have deepened in the hours since their first encounter. He looked at her as though she were a ghost, an apparition summoned from his worst nightmares, and Mira felt a surge of emotion she could not name, something that was part anger and part desperate need to understand. "I need to know," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, and Walter's face crumpled, his defenses finally breaking under the weight of a question he could no longer refuse to answer. Walter Hemsley had not slept properly in 13 years, not since the night fire had rewritten the trajectory of his life and the life of a child he could never acknowledge. The nightmares came with reliable cruelty, pulling him from shallow rest into waking terror, his sheets soaked with sweat, his heart racing as though he were still running through flames. Even now, standing in the doorway of his basement office with Mira Collins staring up at him with eyes that demanded truth, he felt the heat of that long-ago inferno on his skin, smelled the acrid smoke that had filled his lungs and stolen his voice for weeks afterward. He had been 43 then, working construction in a part of Dayton where houses crowded together like teeth, where poverty made neighbors of people who might otherwise never have met. The apartment building where the fire started had been condemned twice but still stood, still housed families who had nowhere else to go. And Walter had been hired to do repairs that everyone knew were insufficient, cosmetic patches over structural rot. He remembered hammering nails into wood that crumbled at the touch, remembered thinking that someone should tear the whole place down before tragedy struck, and then tragedy had struck anyway, as inevitable as weather. The night it happened, Walter had been driving home from a job site, his truck rattling over potholes on streets the city had given up trying to maintain. He saw the smoke first, a column of darkness rising against the twilight sky, and then the flames, orange and hungry, consuming the apartment building he had worked on just weeks before. Without thinking, he pulled over, his body moving before his mind could catalogue the risks, and he was running toward the fire, even as sirens wailed in the distance. People were screaming, pouring out of doorways with whatever they could carry, and through the chaos, Walter heard it, a child crying, the sound muffled and desperate, coming from somewhere on the second floor. Later, investigators would determine that the fire had started in the electrical system, ancient wiring finally giving up under demands it was never designed to meet. But in that moment, Walter knew only that someone was trapped and that the fire department was still minutes away and that minutes might be too long. He grabbed a discarded jacket from the ground, soaked it in water from a neighbor's hose, wrapped it around his face, and ran into the building, taking stairs 2 at a time as smoke filled his vision and heat pressed against him like a physical force. He found her in a second-floor apartment, a little girl no more than 2 years old, standing in a crib and screaming for her mother who was not there, who had perhaps stepped out or been at work or been lost in the confusion of evacuation. The smoke was thick enough to choke on, acrid and black, and flames were beginning to eat through the wall between rooms, creating patterns that seemed almost alive in their hunger. Walter wrapped the child in the wet jacket, pressing her against his chest, and ran back toward the stairs. But the route he had taken was already blocked, flames having spread with terrifying speed through the dried timber and cheap materials that constituted the building's bones. He pivoted, searching desperately for another way out, and found a window, its glass already cracked from the heat. Using his elbow, he shattered what remained, ignoring the pain as shards cut into his skin, and looked down at the drop that seemed impossibly far, but was the only option left. Fire engines were pulling up below, firefighters shouting instructions, and Walter held the child out the window, waiting until he saw arms reaching up, ready to catch before he let her go, releasing her into the air with a prayer that was more instinct than belief. She fell into the safety net they had stretched below, her small body bouncing once, before being gathered into protective arms, and Walter felt relief crash through him with such force that his knees nearly buckled. But his own escape was not so simple. The window was too small for his frame, and the smoke was stealing consciousness from him with every breath. He remembered trying to climb through anyway, remembered the sharp pain as broken glass carved into his wrist, remembered the way his vision narrowed to a tunnel and then to nothing at all. When he woke, he was in a hospital, bandaged and breathing oxygen through a mask, and a nurse was explaining that he had been pulled from the building just before part of it collapsed, that he was lucky to be alive, that the child he had saved was already in protective services, since her mother had not survived the fire. Walter had asked about the little girl, about where she would go, what would happen to her, and the nurse had gently explained that such information was confidential, that his act of heroism had saved her life, but that their stories would now diverge, heading in separate directions like roads that briefly intersected before continuing on their individual paths. For months afterward, Walter had tried to find out what had happened to the child, making phone calls and filling out forms and being met with walls of bureaucratic protection designed to shield vulnerable children from curious strangers. He understood the necessity of those walls, even as they frustrated him, even as he lay awake at night, wondering if the little girl remembered anything of the fire, if she woke screaming from nightmares the way he did. Eventually, he stopped searching, accepting that some acts of courage are their own reward, that he would never know how her story continued beyond the moment he released her into the air. He left construction work, the industry having lost its appeal after watching a building he had helped maintain become a death trap, and he found work as a school janitor, a position that felt safer, contained, less likely to result in tragedy. He carried the scar on his wrist as a reminder, a mark that connected him to a night he could neither forget nor fully remember, and he tried to build a life around the empty space where answers should have been. Now, standing before Mira Collins, Walter understood with sudden, crushing certainty that the little girl he had saved had not disappeared into the foster system's anonymous machinery, but had landed in Dayton, in this school, in the path of the man who had given her a second chance at life. The scar on her wrist was the twin of his own, carved by the same broken glass, marked by the same fire, and looking at her face, Walter could see traces of the toddler he had pulled from flame, features that had matured but retained that same essential quality of determined survival. His throat closed completely, emotion choking off words before they could form, and he felt tears he had held back for 13 years finally break free, spilling down his cheeks as the weight of all that time, all that not knowing, all that careful forgetting, collapsed under the simple truth of her presence. "Come in," he managed to whisper, his voice hoarse and broken, and he stepped back to let her enter, knowing that what came next would unmake them both before it could begin to heal them. Walter's office was smaller than Mira had imagined, barely more than a converted storage room, with concrete walls painted institutional white, and a single small window set high near the ceiling, offering a view of the parking lot's edge and nothing more. A metal desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with work orders and maintenance schedules, and along one wall stood shelves holding supplies, cleaning products, light bulbs, tools organized with the precision of someone who found comfort in order. The air smelled of paper and the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaner, and in one corner, leaning against the wall like a forgotten relic, stood a violin case, its leather exterior cracked and worn. Mira's eyes landed on the case immediately, drawn by its incongruity in this utilitarian space, and she felt something inside her chest tighten with recognition she could not explain. Walter followed her gaze, his expression shifting through layers of pain, and he moved toward the case with the careful reverence of someone approaching something sacred or dangerous or both. "I pulled this from the fire too," Walter said, his voice still rough, as though speaking required pushing words through broken glass. "It was in the apartment, on a table near the door. I grabbed it on instinct, thinking someone would want it back, thinking it meant something to whoever lived there." He opened the case carefully, revealing an instrument that had clearly seen better days. The wood was scorched in places, the varnish blistered by heat, one string broken and curling like a question mark. But despite the damage, it was still beautiful in the way wounded things sometimes are, still recognizable as an object crafted with care and intended for creation rather than destruction. Mira stepped closer, drawn by a compulsion she did not understand, and when she was near enough to see the details, she noticed something carved into the wood near the bridge, initials, small and careful, forming the letters MC. Her breath caught, her hand reaching out without permission to trace those letters with her fingertip, and suddenly she was not standing in Walter's office anymore, but somewhere else, somewhere filled with smoke and sound and the overwhelming sense of loss. The memory came not as a coherent narrative, but as fragments, sensory impressions that had been buried so deep Mira had not known they existed. She remembered the smell of smoke, thick and choking, remembered crying out for someone who did not come, remembered hands lifting her, strong and desperate, wrapping her in something wet and rough. She remembered flying, the sensation of falling and being caught, and before all of that, she remembered music, a melody played on violin, simple and sweet, a lullaby her mother had played for her every night, the same song over and over until it became the soundtrack of safety and love. The violin in front of her was that instrument. She knew it with bone-deep certainty, knew that those initials had been carved by her mother, Marianne Collins, who had died in the fire while Mira was being pulled from the flames. The knowledge crashed over her like a wave, drowning her in grief she had been too young to properly feel, grief that had been processed by others and explained away as something she was better off not remembering. Walter watched as Mira's face transformed, saw the moment understanding arrived and broke her open, and he felt his own heart shattering in sympathy. "Your mother," he said quietly, the words an offering and an apology. "She didn't make it out. I tried to go back, but the structure was collapsing, and the firefighters held me back. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The apology felt inadequate. A handful of words trying to fill a chasm of loss, but they were all he had. Mira's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away from the violin, her fingers still tracing those initials, as though she could somehow conjure her mother's presence through touch alone. Around them, the small office seemed to contract, the walls pressing in as the weight of the past reasserted itself in the present, demanding acknowledgement after years of careful avoidance. Walter wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he held himself back, aware that his was the hand that had saved her, and also the hand that had failed to save her mother, that his presence was both gift and wound. "I was adopted," Mira said finally, her voice small and wondering as though she were discovering the word for the first time. "My parents, the Collins family, they told me I came to them when I was 2, that my birth mother had passed away, that I was too young to remember. They said they wanted to give me a fresh start, a chance to grow up without being defined by tragedy." She looked up at Walter, her eyes searching his face for confirmation or contradiction or something she could not name. They never told me about the fire, about how I survived. They just said it was an accident, that my mother had loved me very much, and that I was safe now. Walter nodded slowly, understanding the impulse to protect, to shield a child from trauma by erasing its details, even as he recognized the cost of such protection, the holes it left in identity, the questions it could never fully silence. "The scar," Mira continued, her free hand moving to her wrist. "They said I got it from broken glass when I was playing, that it happened before they adopted me. I believed them because I had no reason not to, because I couldn't remember anything else." She laughed, a sound without humor, brittle and sharp. "But I always had dreams, fragments really, smoke and sirens and someone singing. I thought they were just nightmares, my brain making up stories. I never imagined they were memories." Walter felt the full weight of what his silence had cost her, the way his decision to move on, to accept that he would never know what happened to the child he saved, had left her adrift in a version of her own history that was sanitized and incomplete. He had thought he was respecting boundaries, following the rules that governed such situations. But looking at Mira now, he understood that some truths refuse to stay buried, that they claw their way back to the surface no matter how deep you dig the grave. "I should have tried harder to find you," Walter said, the confession tearing out of him with the force of something that had been trapped too long. "I should have kept searching, kept pushing until I knew you were okay, until I could tell you what happened. But I was a coward. I convinced myself that you were better off without me, without the reminder of the worst night of your life. I let myself fade away because it was easier than facing what I'd witnessed, what I'd failed to prevent." He gestured at the violin, at the scars they both carried, at the small office that had become a confessional. "But you're here now, and you deserve the whole truth, every piece of it, no matter how much it hurts." Mira nodded, tears streaming down her face, and she reached out, her hand finding his, their scarred wrists touching in a gesture that felt like recognition, like a circle finally closing, like two halves of a story that had been separated finally finding their way back to each other, broken and beautiful and undeniably, irreversibly connected. Walter began to speak, and the words came slowly at first, rusty from disuse, as though he were excavating a language he had forgotten how to speak. He told Mira about the night of the fire, in detail she had never heard from anyone, detail her adoptive parents either did not know or had chosen to withhold. He described the building, the way it had been held together more by habit than structure, the electrical work he had done, knowing it was insufficient, but telling himself it was better than nothing, that he was just a worker following orders, not responsible for the decisions made by landlords who valued profit over safety. He told her about the moment he heard her crying, about the way that sound had cut through his fear and driven him into the flames, when every instinct screamed to stay back, to let the professionals handle it, to preserve his own life, instead of risking it for a stranger. He described carrying her down through smoke so thick it turned the world to midnight, about the way she had clung to him with surprising strength for someone so small, her fingers digging into his shirt, as though she could anchor herself to him, and thereby anchor herself to survival itself. He told her about the window, about the moment of decision when he realized they could not escape the way they had entered, that the only path forward was a terrifying leap into uncertainty. He described the feeling of holding her out over empty air, of seeing the firefighters below preparing to catch her, and the split second of absolute terror when he released her and watched her fall, praying with intensity he had not known he possessed that the net would hold, that gravity would not claim her the way the fire had claimed so much else. He told her about the glass that had cut them both, his wrist and hers, marking them with matching wounds that would become scars, permanent reminders of the night their lives had intersected. And then he told her the part that hurt most. The part he had replayed in his mind countless times, with variations that always ended the same way, about how he had tried to reach her mother, about how he had seen the woman through the smoke, collapsed near the doorway of her apartment, overcome by fumes before she could escape, and about how the flames had been too fierce, the structure too unstable, for him to reach her in time. "I wanted to save her too," Walter said, his voice breaking. "But the floor was already giving way, and the firefighters were pulling me back, shouting that it was too dangerous, that I'd already done more than anyone could ask. I fought them, I swear I did, but they were stronger, and they were right. Going back in would have been suicide, and it wouldn't have changed anything. She was already gone." He looked at Mira, at the tears coursing down her face, and felt his own grief merge with hers, creating something larger than either of them alone could contain. "I've carried that failure every day since. Every time I mop these floors, or fix a broken lock, or replace a light bulb, I'm reminded that I'm good at small repairs, at maintaining things. But when it really mattered, when a life hung in the balance, I could only save one person out of two. I saved you, and I'm grateful beyond measure that I did. But I couldn't save your mother. And that knowledge has been a weight I can't put down." Mira listened with a stillness that seemed to compress all her 12 years into a single moment of terrible understanding. She thought about the Collins family, about their love and their kindness and their careful protection of her from this truth, and she felt a complicated swirl of gratitude and anger, understanding and betrayal. They had given her a good life, a safe life, a life filled with piano lessons and family dinners, and the kind of stable comfort that children who grow up in chaos never know. But they had also erased part of her, had smoothed over the roughness of her origin story until it was palatable, presentable, until it fit the narrative they wanted to create about their family. She did not blame them. Exactly. She understood they had acted from love, from a desire to spare her pain, but she resented the absence of choice, the way they had decided what she could and could not handle, what she should and should not know about herself. "My birth mother's name was Marianne," Mira said, speaking it aloud for the first time she could remember, tasting the syllables as though they were a foreign language she was trying to master. "The Collins told me that much, but nothing else. They said she was young, that she loved music, that she had wanted me to have a better life than she could give me, and that she had died before she could see me grow up. They made it sound peaceful, almost noble, like she had made some kind of sacrifice. They never mentioned fire or fear, or the fact that she died trying to get back to me." Anger flared in Mira's voice, sharp and clean, and Walter recognized it as healthy, as necessary, as the kind of rage that comes when you realize the story you've been told about your own life has been edited for someone else's comfort. "I had a right to know," Mira continued, her voice rising. "A right to understand where I came from, what I survived, who I lost. They took that from me, and I can't get those years back. Those years of wondering and dreaming and making up answers because I didn't have real ones." Walter nodded, accepting her anger, understanding that some of it was directed at him as well, at his failure to search harder, to push through the bureaucratic barriers that had kept them apart. "You're right," he said simply, "about all of it. The adults in your life, myself included, we made decisions we thought were best for you, but we didn't consider that you might need the hard truth more than you needed protection from it. We underestimated you, and I'm sorry for that." He reached for the violin case, closing it gently, and then held it out to Mira, offering it as though it were a sacred relic, which in a way it was. "This belonged to your mother, and now it belongs to you. It's damaged, maybe beyond repair, but it's yours. Whatever you decide to do with it, keep it, restore it, put it away somewhere, and never look at it again, that's your choice to make. Nobody gets to decide for you anymore what parts of your past you're allowed to carry." Mira took the case, her hands trembling under its weight. And in that exchange, something shifted between them, a transfer of responsibility and acknowledgement that felt like the first step towards something neither could yet name, but both desperately needed. That evening, Mira returned home to the Collins house with the violin case clutched in her hands, its weight a physical manifestation of everything that had changed in the span of a single school day. The house was a comfortable split level in a neighborhood where lawns were maintained and Christmas lights went up the day after Thanksgiving, a place of order and predictability that Mira had always taken for granted. She found her adoptive parents, David and Sarah Collins, in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the easy coordination of people who'd been together for decades. They looked up when she entered, their smiles of greeting faltering when they saw the case, and Mira watched as recognition and then fear moved across their faces like weather. "Where did you get that?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral, but Mira heard the tremor beneath it, the knowledge that a moment long dreaded had finally arrived. Mira set the case on the kitchen table, displacing placemats and salt shakers, claiming space with the deliberateness of someone asserting a right. "I got it from Walter Hemsley, the janitor at my school," she said, watching their faces carefully, noting the way David's jaw tightened and Sarah's hand moved to her throat in an unconscious gesture of protection. "He's the man who pulled me from the fire you never told me about, the one where my birth mother died." The words hung in the air, accusatory and unavoidable, and Mira felt a surge of power mixed with fear. Power because she was finally demanding the truth, fear because she did not know what that truth would do to the family they had built together. David and Sarah exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them in the way of long married couples. And then Sarah pulled out a chair and sat, gesturing for Mira to do the same. "We always knew this conversation would happen," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "But we kept hoping we'd have more time, that you'd be older, better able to understand the choices we made." She reached across the table, her hand seeking Mira's, and Mira allowed the contact, though she did not return the squeeze. "When you came to us, you were traumatized, having nightmares every night, waking up screaming for your mother, terrified of the dark and of anything that smelled like smoke. The social workers told us you needed stability, routine, a chance to feel safe again. They suggested that dwelling on the details of the fire might make it harder for you to heal, that children your age often do better when they're allowed to move forward without the weight of trauma constantly reinforced." Sarah paused, gathering herself, and Mira saw the genuine pain in her mother's face, the evidence of years spent wondering if they had made the right decision. David spoke next, his voice gruff with emotion he rarely displayed. "We loved you from the moment we met you. Mira, you were so small, so hurt, and we wanted nothing more than to make the world safe for you again. Maybe we went too far in trying to protect you. Maybe we should have given you more information as you got older. But every time we thought about sitting you down and telling you the whole story, we'd remember how you were in those first months. The nightmares, the fear, the way you'd panic if we tried to light candles on your birthday cake, and we'd decide to wait just a little longer, until you seemed stronger." He shook his head, frustration and regret evident in the gesture. "We never meant to lie to you, honey. We just wanted to give you a childhood that wasn't defined by the worst thing that ever happened to you. But I see now that in doing so, we took something from you that we had no right to take. Your full story, your connection to your birth mother, your understanding of where you came from." Mira listened, her emotions a tangle of anger and sympathy, betrayal and love. She understood their intentions, could even see the logic in their choices, but understanding did not erase the hurt, did not fill the holes that had been created by years of partial truth. "I met him today, Walter," she said, bringing the conversation back to the immediate catalyst. And I saw his scar, the one that matches mine, and suddenly I knew that everything I'd been told was incomplete. He told me about the fire, about carrying me out, about watching my birth mother die because he couldn't reach her in time. He's been carrying that guilt for 13 years, living with the knowledge that he saved me, but couldn't save her. And nobody ever told me that I owed my life to a school janitor who never said a word, who saw me every day and stayed silent because he thought that was what he was supposed to do. Her voice broke, emotion overwhelming the anger that had sustained her through the conversation, and suddenly she was crying, great, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, released by the weight of finally knowing. Sarah was out of her chair in an instant, gathering Mira into her arms the way she had done countless times throughout Mira's childhood. And this time, Mira let herself be held, let herself be comforted even as she grieved for the mother she had lost, and the years of connection she had been denied. David joined them, his arms encircling both his wife and daughter, creating a shelter of bodies against the storm of revelation. They stayed like that for long minutes, crying together, and when they finally pulled apart, Mira felt something shift. Not a resolution exactly, but a new understanding that their family, like all families, was built on both love and imperfection, on choices made with good intentions that sometimes caused hurt anyway. "I want to see him again," Mira said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Walter, I mean. I want to know more about that night, about my birth mother, about everything you didn't tell me, and I want you to meet him, to hear his side of the story, because he's part of mine now, part of what made me, and I can't pretend anymore that the past can just be left behind." The Collins looked at each other again, and this time Mira saw acceptance in their faces, a willingness to step into discomfort for her sake. "Of course," David said, "whatever you need, however we can help you understand, we'll do it. We should have done it years ago." Sarah nodded agreement, and Mira felt something inside her chest loosen slightly, the beginning of forgiveness, mixing with the anger and grief in a way that felt messy and real, and ultimately more honest than the careful protection that had characterized her childhood until now. That night, Mira took the violin case to her room, opening it carefully and looking at the damaged instrument her birth mother had played, and she wondered if music might be a bridge, a way of connecting to the woman she had lost and the life she might have had. She did not know if the violin could be repaired, if its scorched wood and broken strings could ever produce sound again, but she decided she would try that restoration, even incomplete, even imperfect, was worth the effort, was perhaps the only way forward when the past had been broken beyond any simple repair. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when frost edged the windows and the November sky hung low and grey, Mira and her adoptive parents drove to Walter Hemsley's apartment, a modest place in a part of Dayton, where buildings leaned slightly and where the streets bore names that honored wars long concluded. Walter had agreed to the meeting with reluctance that quickly turned to something like relief, as though he too had been waiting for permission to stop carrying his burden alone. He met them at the door of his ground-floor unit, his nervousness evident in the way his hands moved, adjusting his collar, smoothing his hair, before finally gesturing them inside. The apartment was spare but clean, furnished with pieces that looked second-hand but cared for, and on one wall hung a photograph, the only decoration Mira could see, showing a younger Walter standing before the construction site where he had once worked, his smile genuine and untroubled in the way of people who have not yet witnessed tragedy firsthand. They sat in Walter's small living room, the four of them arranged awkwardly on furniture that had not been designed for gatherings, and for several minutes nobody spoke, each waiting for someone else to break the silence that felt both necessary and unbearable. Finally, it was Sarah who began, her voice soft but determined, "Thank you for saving our daughter," she said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to unlock something in the room, allowing emotion to flow where before there had been only careful restraint. "We've known for years that someone pulled her from that fire, but we never knew who, never had a name or a face to attach to our gratitude. Now we do. And I want you to understand that you gave us everything when you carried Mira out of that building. You gave us the chance to be parents, to love her and watch her grow. And we can never repay that, but we can acknowledge it, can tell you that your courage mattered, that it changed our lives as much as it saved hers." Walter's eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide, and he nodded, accepting the thanks, even as Mira could see him struggling with the guilt that still lived in him, like a second heartbeat. "I only wish I could have saved her mother too," he said, his voice rough, "that I could have brought them both out, given Mira the life she was meant to have, instead of the one that was forced on her by circumstance and fire." David leaned forward, his expression serious but kind, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had thought carefully about what needed to be said. "You did what you could in an impossible situation, and that's all anyone can ever ask. You gave Mira a chance at life, and what we built from that chance, the family we became, that's not a consolation prize or a second best. It's real, and it's good. And it exists because of your choice to run toward danger instead of away from it. Both things can be true. Mira lost her birth mother, and that's a tragedy that can't be undone or made okay. But she also gained a future, and that future has been filled with love and possibility." Mira watched the adults around her navigate the complicated terrain of grief and gratitude, of acknowledgement and forgiveness, and she felt something inside her begin to settle, the pieces of her identity that had felt jagged and incompatible starting to find a way to coexist. She pulled the violin from its case, the instrument looking even more damaged in the grey November light, and she held it out toward Walter. "I've been taking it to a luthier," she said. "Someone who specializes in restoration. He says it will never sound exactly like it did before the fire, that the scorch marks and the stress on the wood have changed its voice permanently, but that it can still make music, that it can still be played if I'm willing to accept it as it is, rather than as it was." She traced the initials carved into the wood, her mother's mark, and then looked up at Walter, at her adoptive parents, at the three people who together formed the constellation of her origin story. "I think that's true for all of us, isn't it? We've all been changed by that night, marked by it in ways visible and invisible, and we can't go back to who we were before, but maybe we can move forward as we are now, with all our scars and all our love and all our complicated truth." Walter reached out tentatively, his hand hovering near Mira's for a moment before she took it, their matching scars pressed together in a gesture that felt like recognition and acceptance and the closing of a circle that had been broken open 13 years before. Sarah and David joined them, their hands finding places in the constellation, and for a moment they existed as a unit, separate lives bound together by tragedy and rescue, and the choice to acknowledge rather than ignore the connections that tied them. "I'd like to be part of your life," Walter said, looking at Mira but also at her parents, asking permission, offering himself, not as a replacement for anyone or anything, but as someone who cares about you, who has always cared about you, who wants to know that you're okay and to be there if you need me. I don't know what that looks like, don't know if there's a name for the relationship we have, but I know it matters to me, and I hope it might matter to you too." Mira felt tears on her face again, but they were different from the ones she had shed in Walter's office or at her kitchen table. These tears felt like release rather than discovery, like the final acknowledging of a grief she had carried without knowing its name. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I want that. I want to know you, to hear more stories about that night and about my mother, and about how you've lived with what happened. I want you to meet my friends and come to my school concerts and be part of the ordinary days, not just the traumatic ones. You're connected to the worst thing that ever happened to me, but you're also connected to the fact that I'm alive at all, and that's not something I can separate or want to." She looked at the Collins, at her parents who had raised her with such careful love, and saw acceptance in their faces, permission to expand her family in ways that were unconventional but necessary. "We're all in this together now," she said, "whether it's neat or makes sense or fits any normal definition of family. We're bound by fire and rescue and the choice to acknowledge that the past shapes us but doesn't have to destroy us." As the morning stretched into afternoon, the awkwardness in Walter's apartment gradually dissolved, replaced by the tentative comfort of people learning to be vulnerable with each other, to share stories that hurt and heals in equal measure. Walter told them about the years after the fire, about the nightmares and the therapy and the decision to leave construction for janitorial work, seeking environments where his failures could be measured in broken light bulbs and scuffed floors, rather than in lives lost. Sarah and David told Walter about Mira's childhood, about the piano lessons and the school plays, and the gradual emergence of a confident girl from the traumatized toddler they had first brought home. And Mira, sitting at the center of these converging narratives, began to see herself as the product of multiple origins, her birth mother's love and music, the fire that took her and gave her, Walter's courage, and the Collins family's patient devotion. She was not one thing or another, but all of them together. A person built from broken pieces that had been reassembled into something new, something that bore the marks of damage, but also the evidence of care, of intentional reconstruction, of the choice to create beauty from ash. When they finally left Walter's apartment, the sky was darkening toward evening, and Mira carried the violin under her arm, its case bumping gently against her side with each step. She looked back once to see Walter standing in his doorway, his hand raised in farewell, his face showing something she had not seen there before, peace, or at least the beginning of it, the first suggestion that forgiveness might be possible, not just from others, but from oneself. In the car, with her parents quiet in the front seat, giving her space to think, Mira imagined the day when she would take the restored violin and play the lullaby her birth mother had once played for her, when she would make music from the instrument that had survived fire just as she had, and she imagined Walter in the audience, listening, and her adoptive parents beside him, and all of them bound together by the understanding that survival is never simple, that rescue has ripple effects that extend across years and across lives, and that sometimes the most important act of courage is not the dramatic moment of running into flames, but the quieter, harder work of allowing wounds to be seen, acknowledged, and slowly, painstakingly healed.